Good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining us for tonight's webinar on the newly released FDA guidance policy related to temporary compounding for certain drugs for hospitalized patients by pharmacy compounders not registered as outsourcing facilities during the COVID-19 public health emergency. My name is AJ Day. I'm the Vice President of Clinical Services here at PCCA. I'm joined by my colleagues, Dr. Ross Caputo and Dr. Matt Martin, who's joining us remotely. Thank you, gentlemen, both for being here. At this time, I'd like to hand things over to my colleague, Dr. Matt Martin, to start off our webinar.
All right, thank you, AJ, and thank you, everyone, for joining us on short notice. This is a really huge moment here for FDA to take and put out this policy and provide 503A pharmacies the opportunity to help support our hospitals right now. So one quick disclaimer, in talking about this guidance or talking about the parts of Section 503A from the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, PCCA, or any of us talking on this presentation are not giving anyone legal advice. But if you do have the need for legal advice around this or other topics, we'd be happy to provide you some references to attorneys for you to consider. Okay? So let's jump right into the guidance. What is FDA trying to accomplish with this? As you all know, under Section 503A for pharmacies, you would have to have a patient-specific prescription in order to provide a compounded medication. You would also be prevented from making a copy of a commercially available drug. FDA has said, okay, we recognize that there is these shortages of drugs in hospitals right now. So for a specific set of drugs, they are going to say you don't have to have a patient-specific prescription for these drugs. Okay, and we'll get to that list in just a minute. And you can also make the exact same thing as what is commercially available, the same thing as the manufactured product for these specific sterile drugs, as long as you meet all of the circumstances in the guidance, and we're going to talk about each of those pieces, as well as you have to comply with the rest of 503A. Okay, so anything that's not talked about in here is still something that you need to consider, and we're going to look at those pieces, all right? So the other parts of 503A that are still something that you need to consider. One, your APIs and your excipients must meet a USP or NF monograph if one exists, okay? Your APIs have to have a valid certificate of analysis, and the APIs have to come from an FDA-registered manufacturer. So I want to pause for just a moment here and talk a little bit about the legal requirement related to that and what PCCA does in relation to APIs. The law says, just like we've got here on the screen, that your APIs have to come from a registered manufacturer. Registration is a process of filling out an online form. In theory, one of us could fill out a form and be registered in relatively short time. By being registered, it means you're supposed to comply with CGMP as a manufacturer of APIs. At PCCA, we don't think that is sufficient. We require our API manufacturers to not only be FDA registered, but also inspected, to have somebody in there that's verifying that they're really doing the things that they say they do, along with an extensive API manufacturer qualification program as a part of something that we call the PCCA standard. So I would encourage all of you, as you consider the quality of the APIs that you may use for this or for compounding any medication for patients, to review our website, the PCCAstandard.com, and walk through that quality process that has been put in place to ensure that your patients are receiving the highest quality chemicals and active ingredients for the purposes of compounding for patients. The other thing that you need to be highly aware of, if you're not already, is the Insanitary Conditions Guidance document from FDA. This is by far the most commonly cited issues by FDA in their 483s on compounding inspections. And I'm thrilled that we have with us Dr. Ross Caputo. I think Ross can elaborate on the importance of ensuring that you do not have insanitary conditions and what the folks that they work with as their clients through Eagle Consulting in trying to help deal with some of these issues that come up for facilities. Ross?
Well, thank you, Matt. I don't think there's any doubt that this is going to be the most significant thing that each of us can do when we are making a product in these stressed environments and stressed activities. We already know that so many of us can't get gloves, or we can't get a sterile gown, or we can't get enough alcohol. And if we do have it, it's in short supply. And so we have to really use it very sparingly and appropriately. But insanitary conditions is the thing that always gets us, isn't it? It's when something happens and we don't see it, or something happens and we don't notice it. And that's the dirt in one corner or the hand over a vial in another corner. A lot of these things go by the wayside when we're in a crisis situation. I ask all of you to pay attention to what you're doing. I ask all of you to take your time. There isn't anything more important right now to absolutely watch what you're doing. We need to be truly focused on the job at hand, to use the best things possible that we can have. If we can get something, you have to use it. When we go in and we're cleaning our hoods, or we're washing our hands, when we're taking time to make sure that now we could be in some situations using gloves a little bit longer than we normally would, or even non-sterile gloves in some situations, where we have to spray it with alcohol, sterile alcohol, where we have to make sure that we get inside the fingers. We have to watch what we're doing. We have to make sure that we don't touch our hands and face. We have to make sure that things, if they get dirty, and I think we can assume something. I think that if we're beginning to use things that aren't actually the pristine environment, that things will be dirtier than they normally are. If you're wearing sterile gowns, or if you're wearing sterile gloves, if you're using a sterile mask, if you're using tons of alcohol and sporicides to clean everything because you have it, it's very easy to keep a clean thing clean. But when it gets dirty, when you get hurried, and when you're moving faster and quicker than you normally would, where you maybe now actually upset the airflow, where you maybe now cause a problem that you didn't have before. You have a patient who needs something and they need it now. Make sure your calculations are correct. Make sure your numbers are right. Make sure what you're doing, that your people who are going to be skittish, technicians will be skittish, pharmacists are skittish. We all are. We have to focus. We have to take a deep breath and really stay in control of our emotions. In sanitary conditions is bottom line, you're doing the right thing every time. You're watching it. You're doing the appropriate testing that you can do, testing that you can get done, testing that is sometimes just test yourself to, I'm not rushing. You can't always test products, right? We know that. And now when some of these things, especially what we're talking about tonight, a non-patient script, getting to a hospital quickly, getting to a patient who needs it to survive. Don't rush yourself out of that good, proper, and what you know to be safe process, getting things done quickly, but getting them done correctly. Insanitary guidelines are common sense, and now more than ever, we need to take that approach and simply, please, watch what you're doing and watch the person next to you. Help them out. Please watch them if they begin to have a sniffle. Please watch them if they begin to shake a bit, and that happens. We're the front line, we're doing a great job, but in sanitary conditions is not just physical. It's person, it's people, it's things. Keep focus. The desire and the dedication that we have to maintain this is what will get all of us through that. I think that's the best thing you can say. Back to you, Matt.
Thank you, Ross. Appreciate that. Yeah, very much so. If you're not familiar with this, I could not encourage you enough to download, go through the document, assess your facility, and ensure that any corrections are made that would be needed. This document is, again, the most commonly cited thing that you're going to see in FDA inspections. And certainly with the opportunity here to serve hospitals, we absolutely have to ensure that none of these violations are occurring, because there are risks to patient care. And as we work with these hospitalized patients, we obviously have people with compromised immune systems fighting challenges right now with COVID-19. And so we have to even farther consider the implications of what would happen if we had any of these conditions existing in a compounding facility. Okay, so let's talk about the guidance document. When are you allowed to compound these drugs for hospitals, these sterile medications for hospitals? The hospital has to be treating COVID-19 patients, and they have to have attempted to get the FDA-approved product, or they also have to have tried to get the medication from an outsourcing facility, or what's also been called the 503Bs. Okay? If the hospital who's treating COVID-19 patients can't get the FDA-approved drug and cannot get what they need from an outsourcing facility, then that is when you are able to compound these sterile medications. Now, a couple of tools that may be useful to hospitals. One is the list of all the outsourcing facilities. This is directly from FDA. And on here are all the list of around 70 outsourcing facilities that currently exist across the country. As they're looking for specific drugs, one way they might make it a little bit easier, FDA has these outsourcing facilities report the medications that they make, and then FDA organizes that information and puts it into a report. And this is available online or a spreadsheet. However, this information is a little bit in the past, because they're waiting on the reports, and they organize it, and they put the spreadsheet together. The most current spreadsheet of the drugs compounded by outsourcing facilities is a report looking at what was being made between January and June of last year. But if a facility was making one of the drugs that FDA has specified, perhaps they are doing that now. Now, certainly things may change. 503Bs may certainly have changed what they were making from this far in the past, but this may be a way to try to identify some facilities that might be able to serve some of the hospitals if the hospitals need to make that determination. Okay? Now, usually this is the other way around. Sometimes boards of pharmacies have said, yes, you can do certain things, but you need to look at FDA's rules, FDA's guidance documents. This time it's the other way around. FDA is saying you can compound some of these sterile medications for hospitals without a patient-specific prescription, but that doesn't mean that your board of pharmacy, that you're licensed by the state where you are or the state where you would be sending the medication to, is going to necessarily share that opinion. So you are going to have to find out from your board of pharmacy where the pharmacy is, and the board of pharmacy where the hospital is, if they happen to be in two different states, whether or not they are accepting of this policy. Okay? So just because FDA has said so doesn't mean every board of pharmacy is going to agree. So please check into this before you engage in this and have an issue with a board of pharmacy that doesn't want to go this route. Okay? Now, okay, finally, what are the drugs? Okay, here is the entire list of drugs that can be compounded. Only these drugs are the ones that can be made as sterile solutions. Okay? You cannot make combinations of these drugs. It's only one API in the formulation. Some of these drugs we do have available for you to compound with. Some of them we do not. Okay? All right. When we think about these formulations and what you're going to make, before we start doing it, I think we need to sit back and consider how the hospitals are used to receiving these medications, because I think it's crucial that we think about providing it in the same way as much as we can, so that there are not mistakes made in the hospitals by them having to think through something new and different with all that they already have going on. So we want to look at making these medications in the same strength. We want to look at the utilization of it. How much would a hospital utilize, and is that reasonable for you to take on in your facility? Is that possible? What quantity is it typically packaged in? How does it come to the hospitals? They probably are used to that quantity. And if you're curious about the FDA-approved products, if you get into their package inserts, they are usually very explicit with exactly the ingredients and amounts of ingredients, except for maybe pH-adjusting agents, with what is in those products. So here I've got just a snippet of the description section, which is where you'll find this information for fentanyl citrate injection. Okay, and it tells you what it has. Each milliliter contains fentanyl citrate equivalent to 50 mics of fentanyl base with the pH adjustment with some amount of sodium hydroxide. So you can review these description sections of package inserts to see exactly what is in these sterile injectable medications. And fentanyl has an important note here that I want to touch on, and we'll look at in the next slide as well. Specifically that fentanyl has this conversion from fentanyl citrate to fentanyl base. Although it's called fentanyl citrate injection, that is its name, the actual strength is expressed as the amount of fentanyl base. And there's a very large difference between fentanyl citrate and fentanyl base. So that is going to be a very key thing that we have to get right for these formulations. All right, the other thing FDA pointed out in going through these guidance documents, there are usually some really useful and important pieces of information that FDA cites as footnotes. All right, and one of those footnotes that I want to call attention to is footnote number 14 in the document. And FDA has made a point to reference this document from a number of years ago where there were issues with some syringes and the types of rubber stoppers that were being used in them. All right, so I want to pull out a section from that document. Here is that. And specifically the drugs affected included fentanyl, rocuronium, midazolam, hydromorphone. So all of these drugs, the ones that are bolded here, are all ones that are on this list of drugs that you could make for hospitals right now, provided that all the conditions are met. But there were already reports in the past about there being issues with this in syringes. And generally, I've not seen FDA be highly supportive of storing drugs in syringes either, in my opinion. So I think that it's important to take note of this and consider that may be better to dispense these drugs in vials as opposed to syringes. And Ross may have some comments on potential container closure issues related to that as well. So, formulations. When you're thinking about what can you do, how can you help hospitals if you want to engage in compounding these sterile medications? Looking at your facilities and your process, and especially as it relates to handling a number of these drugs because they are opioids, and preventing exposure to you or to your staff. Okay, do you have a containment ventilation enclosure, a powder containment hood in your ante room to be able to handle these opioids? What I would want to prevent is people handling these quantities of opioids in an uncontrolled environment. That's also something that's been cited by FDA under insanitary conditions. There was a specific citation to the handling of an opioid without proper containment in a 483. But more so than an FDA inspection, my concern is certainly the exposure to you or your staff with these potent drugs, especially something like fentanyl, where the drug is dosed in micrograms, and a very, very small exposure could have very detrimental effects to you or someone on your staff. So in the event that you don't have the appropriate facilities to do this, that's something I think that we have to pause and say, okay, is this something that we are going to choose to be involved in? Do we really have the right setup for this? The other thing about getting into a number of these controlled substances is keeping up with all the documentation, as well as, for me, thinking about how you're going to trace how that was used every time. There's not a specific rule on this that I would point to, but I think this is more of a best practice or something that I would urge you to consider. We used to implement a system where we would both weigh the container before and after having weighed out the amount of controlled substance, documenting this, showing that the weight that was removed made sense based on what the container weighed both before and after we removed that amount of drug. And then the next time that we went to weigh out that controlled substance, we would have what the container weighed as far as the last time it was used, and it should still pretty much weigh the same thing. And that would help us watch for any drug that could have gone missing, or perhaps there was documentation missing. But I think this is something you want to make sure that you keep up with and knowing where all these controls are going as you're using them. There's also some documentation requirements. So I guess FDA was considering, well, some hospitals may have pharmacies that are going to make these, right? This is not the case for almost all of you, if not all of you. If so, the order's got to be marked that it's for patients during COVID-19 public health emergency, and they want the hospitals to provide back to you records of the patients who were getting these drugs. And they want that done within a month of the time that you send the drug to the hospital. So this is a look-back provision, if you will. So, and they want this information to move back and forth to have in case there needed to be a recall or there was some issue identified with the drug, that they would know which patients that drug went to. So that's what that information is there for. All right. Now, as far as when you make these things, what about beyond use dates? Are we just talking 797? What are we talking about? No, we're not. FDA has a number of provisions about the beyond use dates. There are some beyond use dates given in the guidance document. We'll look at those in just a second. But as you would normally do, if you had other information, either from the manufacturer, from published literature, from your own data that said the drug should have a shorter beyond use date, then that's what it's got to have. We're not going to extend that beyond use date as long as we can, just because we can, if there is scientific data that tells us to back that beyond use date on down. Also, in Ross's comments previously, he's talking about some of the issues that exist with PPE right now. FDA has a guidance document on how to deal with some of those issues with PPE right now. But in the event that you don't have the PPE that you would normally have and what you're supposed to have, that is also going to reduce the beyond use dates that you can have for these drugs. Okay, so they're looking at 24 hours at room temp or 3 days refrigerated in the event that you're having to use some of these modified PPE. Okay, and so again, here's one of the footnotes where they've got some of this important information that says if you don't have what you need for the PPE, you're supposed to follow the PPE guidance document, and then you're also supposed to bring down the BUDs. There is one question I have, because in this new temporary compounding document, they only reference room temperature and refrigerated storage. The temporary PPE guidance document also allows for frozen storage up to 45 days, but they didn't mention frozen storage in the compounding document. Okay, why does that difference exist? I don't know, but I just want to point it out that the only thing they reference in the compounding document is room temperature and refrigerated storage in these conditions where you don't have the normal PPE that you would suspect to have. All right, so if you do have what you need and there isn't any scientific data that would restrict your beyond use dates, these are the beyond use dates you're given for your formulations depending on how you produce it and how you store it. Okay, so first one, drug is aseptically processed, no sterility test before you send the drug out the door, 4 days room temperature, 6 days refrigerated. Okay. Alternatively, the drug is terminally sterilized. You have a verified sterilization cycle with biological indicators, but you didn't do a sterility test. Okay, so FDA is showing that they favor terminal sterilization, which I think we would expect, and they're going to offer 10 days of room temperature storage or 12 days of refrigerated storage, but that's both terminally sterilized with a verified sterilization cycle. It's not just I put it in the autoclave, it's that you validated that sterilization cycle. Very, very key point. Last but not least, if you aseptically processed it or terminally sterilized it, either one, however you did your sterilization, and you have a sterility test pass, now you get up to 20 days at room temperature and 22 days refrigerated. Now, you may be looking at that and say, well, that's great. I could have 20 or 22 days, but, hey, a sterility test under USP 71 takes 14 days. Well, there is some sort of silver lining here. Again, in the footnotes, this very important statement is talked about, footnote number 15, that the sterility test may include a rapid sterility test as well as the sterility testing described in USP. So with that, I want to turn it back to Ross to let Ross talk about rapid sterility testing, what is available through Eagle and ScanRDI.
Thank you, my friend. Before I get into the scan part here, we need to talk a little bit about those dates and what was going on, because there's some things there that I don't want us to lose track of. We need to make sure, we talked earlier about container closure integrity. We want to make sure it's at the right, whether it's a glass vial or some sort of syringe or some other sort of container. All of that good work that you've been doing in the past, let's not forget it. You can't use something that you don't know works. The biggest issues that we deal with in sterility is once you make something sterile, it's keeping it sterile. So that goes into the right container, it goes into the right container closure system, it goes into the right packaging, it goes into the right storage, all of that. And that sometimes gets overlooked because not all syringes are created equal. I can guarantee you not all vials and closures are created equal. Routinely, we have our members complaining about how did this happen? I've always used a vial and a rubber stopper closure. I got a different closure. I got a different crimper. It doesn't work. Try not to do anything unique at this point in time with the tried and true method of what you're putting in place and what's going on. I think that the one thing that this document does give you, it gives an underscore of what the FDA is putting in here, something that they've always permitted GMP people to do. Rapid methods can be validated. They're actually much more sophisticated, much more sensitive, and they work very quickly. As you know, Eagle's been doing ScanRDI for almost a little over a decade. And ScanRDI is a system that is very sensitive. It's been respected and referenced in FDA GMP manufacturers for a very long time. State boards of pharmacy in one particular state out west requires it pretty much for a 503B. 503Bs use ScanRDI. ScanRDI is a method for you to get your product in, get it sterility tested, know that it's good, and you have your data back within a business day, 2 business days, you're there. There are many systems that are out there that are in fact rapid, but none are as rapid as Scan. You can get another method, and we've evaluated many of them, but we don't think 7-day turnaround time is as good as a day and a half. We don't think that what you need to do if you're looking at 20-day shelf lives, 25-day shelf lives, heck, even 30-day shelf life, you want to give up more than half of that to a sterility test that frankly is antiquated and doesn't work as well. The ScanRDI methodology is not good for all products. I can tell you that the majority of the products that you saw on that list have already been validated by other people and other systems that they do work. And the method suitability requirements that get put in place do in fact work. They do in fact show that it makes it safer for you. You mitigate your business risk. You mitigate patient risk. It's getting your product, a safe product, to your patients sooner to help them. They're already immunocompromised. We can't take chances. We never would take a chance. But at the end of the day, it's the right way to do it. And I for one, am tickled to death that the FDA does in fact show their hand and say, listen, they know that the science is right. They know that it works. It's some specific boards of pharmacies that say no, and yet others say yes. At this point in time, from this perspective, we have to make sure our I's are dotted and T's are crossed, and I beg you to, whenever possible, to use the SCAN system. It's very quick. We are in a time crunch. You need to use all this limited BUD dating to be able to give it to your patient, to be able to give it to them to make sure that they can get it in time and use it the way they need it. I'm tickled to death about it. And yes, we will be trying to educate everyone we can to make sure that they understand the science. And we will be publishing at Eagle even more data on its performance, more data on its comparison to USP 71 to help everyone be comfortable in the regulatory perspective and in the science perspective to know where it works, how it works, and why it makes everything safer. I can't speak highly enough of it because we know that it works better in our own shop and own operations. So there you go, my friend. Question?
Thank you, Ross. Well, one quick point. The guidance document doesn't talk about endotoxin testing, and I was just wondering if you could talk just briefly about your recommendations for consideration of adding endotoxin testing to any of these formulations that people would be making, or other testing that you think should be highlighted.
Thank you, Matt. And I wanted to discuss endotoxin. I went right by it. If you are using sterile water for injection, if you're using an API that's coming from a reputable manufacturer, someone as PCCA that measures pretty much everything, has the CFA, that you know how you put your process together, endotoxin should be a minimal issue. As you know, there was here a few months ago an issue where the API itself was contaminated, not at PCCAs, but others are out there. If you use the best ingredients, please use sterile water for injection. Please don't use distilled water from Piggly Wiggly. Please don't use other things like water for irrigation, which is a medical device. Don't use those things because you don't have that same confidence limit. If in fact we were out of water, we were out of all these things here, I would tell you you'd have to test endotoxin. I would tell you that you would have to test potency. Potency is a mathematical calculation. If you're using a PCCA formula, you know that 795 says if you do it this way, and you can use your reference checks. PCCA's formula are excellent. They're correct. Make sure that your math is right. I personally would tell you that if you're going to make a large amount for large groups at hospital levels or even for your own practice, please do that classic proficiency testing to know that what you've done, what you think you have done from a calculation perspective is correct. Endotoxins, if you use the right thing at the right time, at the right place, and you're not storing it inappropriately. Storing it inappropriately means you don't store anything in a syringe, thank you. Do not do that. You don't know how they're not integral, they're not storage containers, they're delivery containers. Part of the process is to use them. I get it. But endotoxins and potency are something that you should be able to manage through your process. Sterility and sterility checking is another step of the process. But how many of these new methods, new systems, or different activities are you going to do that you may have not done a media fill process validation on? Many of you have done process validations of exactly how your process is. That is powerful to use today. You know what you can do. You know you've tested some limits. You have the comfort and the experience to understand, done one particular way, it will make a safe and a healthy product to deliver to your patient. How's that work, Matt?
Thank you, Ross.
Okay, buddy.
That is awesome. Thank you. So let's say, all right, you've gone through all of this. You've decided that you are going to try to work with some of your hospitals and you want to move forward. Before you get a hold of the hospitals and try to reach out to them, I think there's a number of things to try to get in order because they're probably going to be part of your conversation with the hospitals. One, you probably need the guidance document and the link to the guidance document. The people in hospitals, as we know, are working admirably around the clock right now, trying to take care of patients. Some of the folks in the hospital pharmacy may not be aware of this guidance document. Okay, so it may be very important to have that resource available to them to show them why you're reaching out, because they may not think you have this ability to do this. If you've talked with your board of pharmacy or the other applicable board of pharmacy for where the hospital is, if they've put out any statements, policy decisions, guidance on this issue, have that available. Or if maybe you've had email contact with the board of pharmacy and you have something from them in writing, have that available. Many hospitals are probably going to want to know about your quality control procedures. When was your last media fill? What is your environmental monitoring like? What is your data from your environmental monitoring? Do you have graphs trending your environmental monitoring data? When was your last board inspection? Are you PCAB accredited? Make sure that all these things are lined up because they're likely to be part of that discussion with the hospital. They may want to review those records before they engage with your pharmacy. So have all that stuff organized and ready to go before you reach out. I think it's also important to consider how much can you really produce, and that may be a decision about how many hospitals, or maybe you start with only one to see how much medication they need and whether or not you are able to produce that appropriately or not. And also figure out when you can start, when can you have all the necessary active ingredients and excipients and vials and everything that you need to get started with producing those medications, as well as when they would become available to the hospital based on the timeline of if you're going to be sending these things out for testing and getting those results, so that there can be clear communication with the hospital about when they can expect to have this alternate supply of medication. Okay, now who are you going to talk to? Usually would start with the inpatient pharmacy. Many times you can call the hospital, call the switchboard, the main number, and potentially ask to speak to the inpatient pharmacy or the director of pharmacy there and attempt to have that conversation or leave a message. A number of hospital pharmacy departments actually post their own phone number online, so that may be another way to try to make contact with them and discuss the possibility of doing this. You may be able to locate the director of pharmacy through sites like LinkedIn and be able to reach out to them. And then you may also want to get in touch with the State Association of Health Systems Pharmacists for where you are and discuss what you are capable of, depending on what you can do and how you may be of service to hospitals in your state in trying to help solve some of these medication shortages. And so with that, I think we'll go back to Dr. Day and see what questions we have coming in.
Thank you, Matt. There are a handful of questions, and I'd like to start with one which is something that's come up a couple of times. So you talked about how this GFI, this policy by the agency, is really limited to the activities around the treatment of COVID-positive patients. What about other medications that might be on shortage that are not necessarily directly related to COVID, or in other words, are not appearing on Appendix A of this policy document?
Okay, appreciate that question. So at this time, FDA is only authorizing those medications on Appendix A. For this purpose of you being able to make those medications and send them to the hospital without a patient-specific prescription. As far as other FDA policy, if there is a medication that's in shortage, which that's something they define as being on the FDA shortage list, not the ASHP list, not a wholesaler shortage. FDA says a shortage is what's on their shortage list. You are allowed to compound that drug because it's on shortage on the FDA list, but it would require a patient-specific prescription for you to be able to make that medication and dispense it. Perhaps FDA will review this as we move forward and bring other medications on the list. But as far as your current ability to make drugs and send them without a prescription, it's got to be only these drugs, these sterile medications on Appendix A of the guidance document.
Thank you, Matt. That was very thorough. So the next question has to do with the actual receipt of a medication order or a prescription, not patient-specific. What does it look like if a pharmacy who's never engaged a hospital is seeking to receive that type of request from them? What should they be expecting or asking for?
So I think what they're asking for is the size, the unit size, so to say like a 10 ml vial, and the number of vials of that medication, as well as the strength of that medication, and then that's what they're looking for to get from the hospital, along with the associated documentation that's required by the guidance document.
And is there anything extra that you would mention related to controlled substance orders?
Well, I think right now, so these are being dispensed without a patient-specific prescription. So as you are transferring Schedule II drugs, I would be looking to do that through 222 forms, through the typical DEA 222 forms. So if for some reason you don't have those, then you may need those, unless, I don't know if anyone has the ability to do that electronically or not. I guess that exists. But that would still need to be kept up with DEA. And then for the Schedule 3 through 5s, I imagine there would already be an invoice, but would need to be an invoice to track the sale of Schedule 3 through 5.
Matt, can you, and Ross as well, can you talk about a little bit of the difference between aseptically processed sterile compounds and terminally sterilized aseptic compounds and advantages of them and why you choose one over the other?
Let me just tell you from a science perspective, it's apples and oranges. From a fully validated terminal sterilization process, has everything together in one sealed container. It's now processed. There's no aseptic manipulations. There's never anything worrying about breaking first air. There's none of that activity. It's perfectly safe. It's sterile. The issue with terminal sterilization is heat label products, that you may not be potent, that you may not have the right potency. You may, in some plastics containers, you begin to get leachables. And so the whole activity from terminal sterilization, from what the focus is from the agency, most of the guidelines, is sterile. Sterile, sterile, sterile. Well, you can have sterile dirt, but it won't do you any good. And so at the end of the day, the terminal sterilization process is all about lack of microorganisms. It will not eliminate pyrogens. You can still very much have endotoxin issues. It's all about sterility and contamination. Heat label products have always been an issue. Combinations have always been an issue with heat history and delivered heat activities, cause all sort of reactions, all sort of chemical reactions, leachings in plastic bags. As many as you know, I cut my teeth in plastic bags years ago. We always worried about plasticizers coming out and what they would do in that activity. So from the perspective of the BUD dates, when they start increasing it, They are not remotely concerned with chemistry and potency. It's all sterility. And not endotoxin, it's all sterility. What do you think, Matt?
I think you nailed it.
So a follow-up on that question is, are there any of the drugs that are on this list, Appendix A, those 13 items, that are unsafe? They are heat label, so they're unsafe for terminal sterilization. And the comment that I'll put onto this answer is, well, the PCCA formulas are designed to first prioritize terminal sterilization. That there's more assuredness with that method. And so if we're going for aseptic manipulations, if it's a filter sterilization process, that's because we found there to be a lack of evidence about stability through terminal sterilization, or we found evidence to show that there is instability through terminal sterilization. Matt, is there anything that you'd like to add on to that?
I think the one thing that I would add to this is attempting to find degradation temperatures for drugs is not a piece of information that tends to be readily available. So many times people are looking at things like melting points, but melting points may not be degradation points. So along those lines, I don't know that we always have perfect information on that. And so if that is not something that's already reported in the literature for a specific drug, then I think you would have to be looking to validate that the potency is not affected by the autoclaving of that solution.
Don't lose track of that when you have two products that are stable of them by themselves, you put them together, do not assume that that stability will stay. It's not straightforward.
So Matt, when you showed that list of Appendix A items, there's 13 items on there, you said this is all that you can compound. So can you clarify about FDA's intent on that being a dynamic process or how that might evolve over time?
Yeah, so FDA is continuing to monitor shortages and issues that exist in hospitals. So it is possible that they may update this guidance as we go along. For any of you that have been following things like the hand sanitizer guidance document that has went through some revisions as questions and things have come to FDA. So they may very well update this guidance document as we go, depending on what shortages exist and what efforts they have to find additional FDA approved drug product to bring in or make available. But yes, I do suspect that they very much could update this, but as far as when or what that will be, we'll have to watch and see.
So those are all of the questions related specifically to this guidance document. There was a question about providing some information for attorneys in various regional areas of the country that may be able to help with this guidance. I would encourage you to contact us either through the Clinical Services Department. You can chat either with Matt directly or another member of our Clinical Services team. Or you can send your question to avproduction@pccarx.com, and they can pass that along to Matt and myself so that we can give you specific information as best possible that's relevant to your area of the country. And we'll have one other question here that is, again, not related to this guidance document, but since we have a couple of moments, I wanted to ask Matt. Here we have a pharmacist that's been asked to make the fit test solutions, the bitter solution, and they found the formulation, but it did not work. And was there any advice that you could provide on finding the exact formulation or the exact ingredients that were in the manufactured product?
Okay, sure. I appreciate that. So it depends on what fit test solution that they were making, perhaps. Probably the most common one that we've been asked about relates to saccharin. Along with that, if you're reading the OSHA regulation on that saccharin fit test solution, it talks about being 83 grams of saccharin added to 100 mils of water. I think sometimes it has tripped up some of us in reading that when it says add 83 grams to 100 mLs, that some people read and go, oh yeah, it's QS to 100 mils, to say that it's an 83% solution, but that's not the case. It says add the 83 grams to 100 milliliters. So the result is a much lower concentration. And if you look at one of the products that is manufactured for this purpose, it's a 45% solution of saccharin in water, so much lower than what some people have interpreted as 83%. So if that is not the particular item that you are looking for, please reach out to me, and I'll be happy to see if we can't help you figure that out.
Matt, Ross, thank you both so much for lending your expertise and helping our members navigate this really hot off the press guidance. This was released this morning. And Matt, Ross, and I discussed very early that this is something that we needed to pull together some expertise to help our members through the process. What does it mean? What does it look like? How do we know what to do? Do we have formulas? Do we have access to information, to products? Help us navigate it. And so I'm very grateful for both of you for being available, as well as to our AV team for staying late yet again to host this webinar. To all of you that have been able to join us tonight, please continue to ask us questions. Contact us directly either through Eagle Analytical, through PCCA and the Clinical Services team, or the Public Affairs team, and we look forward to serving you in the future. Thank you and have a lovely evening.